that, but there were already tax incentives in place. So it may be accelerated to some extent. The real driver of this determination by households and businesses to use their balance sheets to mobilize 65 billion rands worth of investments in rooftop solar is because in 2023, stage 6 became the new normal. Previous times when we've hit stage 6, it's regarded as a national crisis. The president, if he was out the country, would fly back in, all sorts of emergency measures. And that's what happened when the president announced his breakthrough statement on that resulted in the Energy Action Plan. Up to about 30 gigs of renewables is in the pipeline in various ways. If just 10 of those come online in the next 18 months, we could see the ending of most of the load shedding that we currently have. Fleet is offline. So if stage 6 remains a kind of new normal and we don't get off that over time and the EAF remains in the 50s or even below, then building 10 gigawatts of renewables is not necessarily going to get us out of load shedding. So the recent NEF is a good sign. If Eskom can maintain that, I'm a bit skeptical. The only certainty when it comes to the Eskom fleet is uncertainty. No Eskom official can wake up tomorrow morning and predict with certainty what's going to happen. So you can obviously predict planned maintenance, but you can't predict unplanned maintenance when machines trip and they have to be taken offline. At the same time, the Minister of Finance has made it clear that the funding for investing in generation is not available. The focus of the future of Eskom is very much a transmission business, and we're waiting for the transmission company to be properly established. Once we have the transmission company properly established, then we can transfer all the grid transmission assets into that company, hopefully not with too much debt, which would then enable that company to start raising the capital required to invest in our transmission grid. If we don't invest in our transmission grid on a massive scale over the next 5 to 10 years, we will, no matter how much money we mobilize for investment in new generation, we won't be able to put it online. And that's the real challenge. But there's some good news there. There are areas in the country where we have transmission lines but without substations. And so the low-hanging fruit would be to invest in the substations. And Eskom has done a survey of countries around the world where there are substation manufacturing capabilities and are narrowing down where they would procure from. And if they put substations in these areas where you have power lines but without substations, that could release up to 17 gigawatts of capacity use, because then we can really put the renewable 5 years. If we're going to be able to achieve what we need to achieve. But the work that we've done estimates that the investment requirements through to 2050 is about 4 trillion. If we want to achieve energy security and net zero. And so the big question then becomes, how are we going to mobilize those levels of investment? There's plenty of liquidity within the South African financial system. The institutional mechanisms for mobilizing public and private capital in a blended finance type paradigm don't exist. And that's the big challenge when it comes to thinking about how we're going to finance the energy transition. So those are just some initial comments, I think, for where we are at the moment, what the looks like, and also what longer term also looks like.
Great, thank you, Professor Swilling. We'll now open up the panel, the floor to questions. Just to remind you, if you are going to be asking those questions, you can just raise your hand, you can do so. Thirdly, you can also post them in the chat box, or you can send them to me via WhatsApp or email. I have received 2 questions already, and we've touched on those questions on these issues already, but maybe we could just use this opportunity to go into as well. The first one is directed towards you, Professor. You've gone into a bit of detail, but the question is there tangible evidence that renewable energy sources are making.
And there was, for example, reference to the higher than normal wind speeds that contributed to a higher than expected output from the wind farms a little while ago. But I think where there's a very significant undeniable impact is if you have 4.4 gigawatts of rooftop solar, what you're talking about is a whole bunch of households and businesses that are not drawing energy from the grid. Up until the massive increase in the installation of solar panels, you had a lot of people with batteries. Are a big problem for the grid because when load shedding ends, you have to charge the batteries, and that was contributing to spikes and estimates that that's an extra stage. But once you have batteries that start getting charged from your solar panels, that really does begin to make a very significant impact on demand, and may well be contributing to the declining load shedding levels that we're starting to see. So I don't think I've seen a fully fledged calculation of all of this being brought together to actually estimate, but a very reputable energy economics research institution based here in Cape Town called Meridian Economics estimated that if the 5 gigawatts of renewables that could have been signed off back in 2015, when the Eskom CEOs, Matilda Koko and Brian Belepia, refused to sign the power purchase agreements. If they had signed those power purchase agreements and those 5 gigawatts are brought online, that would have reduced, according to that research, load shedding by 95%. So yeah, there's bits and pieces, but I'm not aware of a fully fledged analysis of the total contribution and exactly how much of load shedding is being avoided as a result of renewables. But undoubtedly, it's happening. Yeah.
I want to maybe come in there, Prof. And I mean, when you were talking about the 65 billion rand that's been invested by the private sector to give us, I mean, straight away, I was thinking about what everybody raves about is Vietnam and getting 9 gigs in pretty similar way, but giving a massive, I think, way more than the incentives that we put in place. And I think it's been driven by the desperation, as you said, of level 6. But 65 billion rand for 4.4 gigawatts sounds pretty cheap, actually, when you talk about 4 trillion rand for our transition. Obviously, in that it's the big expense of grid upgrade, etc., and probably we need some bigger machines, as you call them, or bigger plants in that mix. But wow, 4.4 gigawatts for 65 billion sounds like a bargain.
It is, but it's 60% more expensive than if we built 4.4 gigs of utility scale renewables. So if we built a couple of big plants, let's say 10 of them, it would have cost us 60% less. So rooftop solar is actually quite expensive. But for 65 billion, which has no impact on the fiscus, it has an impact in terms of tax collection. But it's basically mobilizing investment off the balance sheets of households and businesses. And I think that's what's strategically significant. That's the lesson. Because going forward, when we think about how we raise capital for our energy transition, how do we continue building balance sheets? Especially if Eskom's not going to be trusted as a reliable off-taker to mobilize investment. And if there's no guarantees, you're going to have to find a way of mobilizing capital off other balance sheets. And that's already happening. That's what's significant, I think, about this, what's happened on rooftop solar.
I'm worried about getting into debate here, but I mean, one of the issues that we're working with, Lester was talking to me yesterday about it. We've got companies who are wanting to put in those, 100 megawatt solar, which we can get them into the microgrids or into the municipal grids, and we've got to find ways now to deal with it through procurement processes, which are up there in themselves. But I think that's also where we probably need to get a lot more urgency in our system in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean that's critical, but for that we are waiting for the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act to come through, which then creates the institutional and regulatory environment for electricity markets. So it's going to be until that goes through, which everyone has really put.
By extension, political will. People saying that national government, et cetera, aren't taking this seriously, and that's why we're in this position. So is there any sense, a tangible sense, that Eskom is not taking this seriously, and they're looking at renewables in a completely different way through a completely different prism, and that ahead on the block here, we're in the end straits here, where we could see an end to load shedding by next year. Then if you could just open it up to the panel. Premier, we start with you if you've got anything to add to that regarding the role from Eskom and governments generally.
I mean, my biggest problem is that it's all about urgency. Never feel enough urgency. And then some of our existing systems don't create that urgency or enable that urgency. We had a whole big mess up around a disaster declaration for energy. I was having a disaster declaration just for energy to enable you to actually speed up processes, to give it the urgency it needs. I mean, I think things are happening, but I mean, just the point that Prof. Swilling's just made is how the private sector are the ones that are stepping up in that 4.4 gigawatts, and it's the private sector that are pushing at the system, wanting to deliver more gigawatts, but we haven't got the grid investment happening. I mean, I hear people saying, "Well, give us the opportunity, we'll build the grid." So that'll be. I think there seems to be, but there's not enough urgency.
Is there anything to add to that?
Well, the Energy Action Plan is government's official kind of policy framework for resolving load shedding. That the large bulk of that was crafted by Eskom during Andre de Ruyter's time. So everything that he gets heavily criticized in government, but in reality, the Energy Action Plan emerged out of Eskom. And it was during the course of towards the end of 2020, when de Ruyter had his Damascus Road experience and realized that unless massive 5 gigawatts of renewables come online every year for the next decade, we'll have permanent load shedding. Came quite a fundamental change of heart. And that has actually influenced government policy. I was, along with the appointment of a Minister for Electricity, but I've changed my view. I think what Ramaphosa has done is introduced a new style of politics, weekly press conferences. He holds think tank sessions where he personally participates and takes notes the whole day. There's contradictory measures in, yes, but on the whole, I think what he has managed to do, which is what we've needed for a very long time, is stitch together some kind of policy consensus within the ANC elite and government that we have to face these challenges and mobilize the investments that are required to make it happen, in particular in renewables. So initially he was critical of renewables. He's completely changed his tune. He talks about 30 gigawatts of renewables is required. And that's just because of the sheer technical, institutional, and financial realities. And he's not a stupid guy. He's absorbed the information, and he's saying that on the whole, most of the time, the right things. That is new, I think. Yeah.
Les, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a change at the Eskom in terms of the views on renewables. If I look at 10 years ago, or even slightly longer, the drive was still around how do we sell electrons and how do we get more coal into the system. I think the fact that it's not sustainable, that's the first thing. The second is that you've got a international and a national market that's shifting, an industry that's changing. If Eskom doesn't change, Eskom's going to be found wanting. And already you find that Eskom's limitations are in fact the ability to make the shift from fossil fuel into the renewable space. I think a positive is the creation of the Gen office at Eskom. I think that was a very positive one. I must also say the last chief exec put a lot more energy into the renewable space in Eskom than we saw in the past. So I think there is this reality that, this shift has to happen. And I think load shedding has created the burning platform that we require to make the shift.
Thank you. While the spotlight's on you, Mr. Less, I think you could start off with answering this question. The slight reprieve from the high stages of load shedding we've seen. Could you elaborate a little more on why we've seen much needed and much welcomed reprieve, at least for now?
I think, again, driven mainly by two factors. One is you've seen units come back into the system that were out on long maintenance outages. So if I look at the Kusile unit specifically, it's come back after being out for close to 6 months. And so we start to see at least 600 megawatts from one unit come back into the system. So that certainly helped. Then we've seen from some of the other power stations, 1 or 2 units come back into the system and remain in the system for, it's been over a week now that we've seen those units in the system. So that is quite positive. So we've got more generation coming back into the system. We also then find ourselves in a sort of period of the year where the load or the demand is in fact lower. And you start to see that that demand also assists with the generation capacity that we have available. I do want to point out, and I think it is quite important for people to not be guaranteed. I think if you look at, again, the vulnerability in the system, we see units come back, they stay in the system for a week or 2, some for shorter, and then we lose. We've been tracking 1 or 2 units at some of the power stations, and we see in the trend is that some units have been out 17 times since January. So again, indicators that you have this vulnerability in the system, and the unplanned factor is something that Eskom just cannot manage. So yes, I'm happy for the reprieve. I think it's good for the people, for the economy. I think the praise that we can actually keep it.
Thank you very much. And if you just go to the chat box there of this, you can get a little more background information that speaks to Eskom taking renewable energy sources, alternative energy sources, far more seriously as we go forward with this crisis. I think that brings a close to the Q&A session of this Digicon. Professor Swilling, do you have any concluding remarks you'd like to add at this point?
I think that there's this bottom-up response by households and businesses is very positive, but there is a negative side to it, which is it's a solution that is viable for those who can afford it. And it leaves a lot of people behind. It actually could reinforce our very problematic inequalities. And particularly when it comes to energy poverty, it might even reinforce that. And so what you're having is households and businesses who have the privilege of being connected to the grid who are choosing not to connect, and they effectively are using the grid as a battery to some extent to kind of complement what they can generate for themselves, and that has costs, and they're not necessarily contributing to those costs. So I think that's a concern that I have out of this bottom-up type solutioning that is happening in the country in response to the normalization of stage 6.
Great. Thank you very much, Prof. Can I say before we close, Albie, you normally give us a tip or Albie's good advice. I don't know if you want to just give us that tip of the week.
No, thanks, Prof. So I think for households, again, in particular, I think when you've got food and you want to refrigerate that food, allow that food to cool down before you put it into the fridge. When you put hot food into a fridge, it actually changes the temperature inside the fridge, and the refrigerator requires more energy to cool that food. So allow it to get to ambient temperature before you store it in the fridge.
Right. Albie always comes up with good tips that help us, I think at the end of the day, save energy, but also save money. Can I say thank you very much, Albie, as usual, but Prof, really good to have you here. Thank you very much for your wisdom, but also for continually through this whole time coming out with either criticisms or solutions. And with your sustainability mindset, it's something that we all need to be cognizant of in building a better future. And I think your last point about the space we find ourselves in at the moment around energy, which in actual fact is pushing our Gini coefficient in the wrong direction. And it's something that all of us need to think about. How do we use our systems, our tax incentives? And I think generally citizens, if I look at what we've done now during a flood period or during a fire period, citizens in this country step up very quickly to help each other. I think there would be an environment to say, well, if I can do it, can I have a little bit extra so that my neighbor can also benefit? I think we've got to continue to think about that, because we also don't want to have exactly the opposite happening, which I think is happening right. But thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And to each and every, thank you very much for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your week.